What's going on YouTube? Cloverbills here, back with another Scarlet Violet video, and today we're going to be discussing two of the best grass types running around right now in the current format, and with no surprise they are Rillaboom and Amoongus, right? And I specifically wanted to discuss these two today, not that because they're like meta breaking or anything like that. You know, these are two Pokemon that people are very much familiar with, but the reason why I wanted to look at both of them today is I'm often asked, you know, especially during like team building sessions, is what would be a better option to use on a team, right? And either it comes down to like Rillaboom or Amoongus in terms of like selecting a grass type, right? Obviously, they're both very good Pokemon at what they do, but therein lies the difference, right? They do different things, and the one that you choose for your team in particular ultimately depends what you need out of that slot. Right, so you have to be able to evaluate your squad, you know, up until those 5 mons, and then in that last slot, you have to ask yourself, what does my team need out of this last slot? And then from there, that's how you ultimately determine whether you get the Rillaboom or the Amoongus, right? And from, you know, with this video, we're gonna look at some of those things that, you know, both of these things can offer, so that way, at the end, you'll be able to better select one that is a little bit more optimal for your team. Okay, so you know, let's just look at some common sets that these two particularly run. So of course this is going to be Grassy Surge. Most often right now Rillabooms are running Assault Vest. Helps deal with the Flutter Mane matchup, especially. It allows you to take like these Moonblast and Shadow Balls and still stay above 50%. So this way, you know, you can still have them go you know, into like a 2-hit KO, sometimes 3 depending on your investment. But of course, you're going to be having Fake Out, you're going to be having Wood Hammer, and then most often you'll be having U-Turn. Now, that being said, there is the flexibility of having Drum Beating in this slot for a little bit of speed control, which is, again, something you have to evaluate your team and judge whether or not you need that over the other. But more commonly right now, it is Wood Hammer. And then here, your last slot, it's either a toss-up between Stomping Tantrum or something like Knockoff. And again, this is also like an evaluation. Which one does your Rillaboom need over the other, depending on what you want out of your squad, right? Do you need the ground coverage or do you need the dark coverage, right? And then typically these can either be like Terra Water or Terra Fire, you know, just depending on how you want to be able to play, you know, their terrestrialized, right? Their Terra type. So, you know, with Fire, you're able to not get burned and you can resist Fire type attacks. Water will help you do that as well. And then by also going Water, the main advantage that you have is that you're not weak to Urshifu Rapid Strike, which is kind of like the whole point of having a Rillaboom, is so that you have something to answer against the Urshifu Rapid Strike. But, you know, if you go Terra Fire, it kind of defeats that purpose, you know, just for that reason. But this is also why sometimes people just go for Terra Water Rillaboom. But it just depends on you, the viewer. But again, I'm just displaying like a common set here. The Amoongus, of course, Regenerator is the popular choice. Rocky Helmet is really good, it can help you gain momentum against, you know, things like Urshifu, Dragonite, and Chien-Pao teams, especially when you go Terra Water. You can resist the ice coverage against those kinds of squads. But typically you have Rage Powder for redirection, you have Spore Pressure, then you have Pollen Puff, and then this is either Protect or this is also Clear Smog. You know, and the reason for Clear Smog is, you know, with the rising usage again of Dondozo, and of course the Hisui and Gudra going for those iron defenses. Now the Amoongus is more needed now than ever to be able to Clear Smog, right? But these are two standard sets, all right? So now what we're going to do is just, I'm going to present to you like some kind of chart where we divide up the advantages of the Rillaboom and Amoongus, and then from there we'll take a look at some tournament teams and we'll see how one squad or how a few squads actually use one over the other and discuss why that was the better choice and how, you know, it probably led to their success in the tour. All right, so let's take a look. Okay, so I just pretty much created this really quickly on a Google Doc just to get the points across. But here we go. So let's look at Rillaboom. So first of all, with Rillaboom, you're going to be getting a bulky Fake Out user, which is great in terms of like, you know, potentially setup. Good for setup plays, okay? Now, Amoongus can technically give you that too, right? In the form of redirection because it has Rage Powder, right? Also good for setup plays, right? And then from there, you have to just determine, okay, do I value the redirection support where I get to protect my partner, or do I want the Fake Out user where I could potentially break a sash and still protect my partner because, you know, I'm denying one kind of slot, right? But then you have to also understand that Rillaboom can only Fake Out one slot, which means the other slot is still free to, you know, click a move, whereas Amoongus it could take both attacks, but you know, it's also vulnerable to like, you know, spread moves just because it can't redirect the spread move. But either way, you get fake out here and you get redirection support there. Okay, so if your team needs, you know, a little bit more redirection, that's what you need. If you already have a fake out user and you don't really need a second one, then perhaps Amoongus might give you the edge in that regard, right? Just to give your team a little bit more variance. Obviously, the Rillaboom is a strong, you know, physical attacker. It puts on more pressure than the Amoongus. The Amoongus is more like a supportive Pokemon, right? It's a bulky mushroom, whereas the Rillaboom is, you know, it actually has the ability to do damage, right? Especially with grassy terrain, wood hammer, okay? And then at the same time, you know, you're really good into, you know, something like Urshifu Rapid Strike and the Ursaluna teams, right? Whereas Amoongus, you can't really exert pressure against those two kinds of Pokemon. You can put him to sleep, right? Which is why I have Sport Pressure here, and then have your other slot deal with those options, right? But again, that's all a bit a difference in the playstyle, right? Do you want to do that with Amoongus, or would you rather just have the direct option of KOing the Rapid Strike and the Ursaluna with the Rillaboom altogether, right? And it's also pretty good into like Basket Legion Rain, right? Just because you have, you know, a grass type attack for, you know, the Basket Legion, and then you can do somewhat neutral damage against the Pelipper. You are weak to Hurricane in that regard, but again, you have an Assault Vest, and a lot of these Pelippers, they're just not really doing a whole lot of damage. So in that sense, you have an advantage there. You can also really put the pressure on the Fluttermanes because you can OHKO them with Wood Hammer. You sometimes, you know, just because Fluttermane's physical defenses just aren't so great, that you don't need a super effective move to be able to one-shot it, right? And Rillaboom, a lot of times, is just able to completely one-shot it, unless you're intimidated, of course. But that's a discussion for another day. But as far as like raw damage, you can do that to a Fluttermane, whereas Amoongus, you can't KO the Fluttermane, but you have resistance against it, so you can resist the Moonblast, all right? And pretty much just take neutral from the Shadow Ball and still live the tail to tail. So you have that going for you. And then at the same time, the Amoongus can also play the healer role on your team, right? Because it has Pollen Puff. So if something has a Sash on your team and you can get it back to full health with something like a Pollen Puff, that's also pretty good. If you have something like Galarian Moltres on your team that, you know, generally appreciates something like a Citrus Berry or Pollen Puff altogether from an Amoongus. So this way you can go and activate your Berserks again and again. You know, Amoongus is probably the better option over something like the Rillaboom. And then at the same time, you know, just providing, you know, instant heal and recovery can sometimes make a difference in a best of 3 in terms of like winning and losing a game, right? Rillaboom can you know, actually, you know, pivot with U-turn, whereas Amoongus also would appreciate a pivot because you have Regenerator. You're able to recover HP when you pivot, but you have to hard switch it. Whereas Rillaboom, you can get off some good chip damage first with U-turn, and then from there you can recycle your fake out because you're basically switching out, switching back in, switching out, switching back in. So that's always very much appreciated. And then at the same time with Rillaboom, now because you're like an offensive grass type that can do damage, you can complete what we call your Fire, Water, Grass core as far as like offense is concerned. So it's basically paired a lot with Urshifu and Heatran, right? And then these three all together can just put on so much pressure and can win you games just like with these three alone, because you get Fake Out, you know, you get a priority move in Urshifu, you can bust through Protects, right? Fake Out plus Surging Strikes is broken, right? Because you can't protect against the Fake Out, because then that's just free damage from Surging Strikes, right? And then at the same time, you provide resistance and a pivot for, you know, your Heatran, because Heatran doesn't like water moves and it definitely doesn't like ground moves. So Rillaboom can really give you some resistance in that sense. And more often, I like to say that, you know, Rillaboom is more often a common partner on a Heatran versus the Amoongus. Not to say that it isn't, right? Because there are still plenty of teams with Amoongus and Heatran together. But, you know, often, according to the data, I think the Rillaboom is a bit more of a common partner with the Heatran. And then at the same time, you're a grass type. And that's why I also put this here, Amoongus Immunity. So if that is something that's, you know, something that you need, then the Rillaboom is also a pretty good option. And then at the same time, Amoongus can give you that too, right? And I could have put that here where your own Amoongus is immune to another Amoongus because, you know, you're both grass types, so you can pretty much ignore it. But at the same time, what Rillaboom can do is ignore Rage Powder. Not just the fact that you can't get slept by Spore, but you can just ignore Rage Powder and just actually target the slot that the Amoongus normally can redirect against, right? So hopefully now that you get a sense of like where you would use these two, honestly, it just really depends. And then at the same time, you know, with Amoongus, this is probably the most important thing. It gives you something to play in the Trick Room games, right? Whereas Rillaboom, you do have Fake Out, but you have to constantly pivot and cycle, and sometimes you might get out of position that way. Whereas the Amoongus can just say, you know what, I'm the fastest thing in Trick Room now. I'm just gonna use that against you and spore things, right? So that's something that you can also use on your team, where like if you have 5 fast offensive threats, but you have nothing to either deny Trick Room or nothing to be able to use or play in Trick Room to give you a chance, Amoongus is always just slapped on there as that 6th slot and can give you that option to be able to play within the Trick Room matchup. All right, so now that we've discussed some of these, you know, pros that both can offer, let's take a look at some tournament teams and let's discuss why one option is much better than the other in terms of Rillaboom versus Amoongus. Okay, so let's look at this team in particular. So this is SG Les 124, so an 8-1 record from the Yokohama World Championships Prep Tour. Let's just look at the standings here. Yeah, they actually won the whole thing. So let's take a look at this. So there's an Amoongus here as opposed to Rillaboom. So let's see if this was in fact a better choice to use as opposed to Rillaboom, right? So we've got Dragonite, Fluttermane, Iron Hands, Crest Ursaluna, okay, and then finally here's the Amoongus in the 6th slot. So this is a Cresselia Ursaluna team, which means there's gonna be some play centralized around Trick Room, right? Well, Amoongus does relatively well in Trick Room, right? Because now what you can do is be the fastest thing in Trick Room, spore things, and then have something like Ursaluna and Iron Hands be able to finish off certain slots because they also will be fast in Trick Room. It's just the Amoongus is faster, right? And then at the same time, you know, you can also help Cresselia set up the Trick Room by redirecting and then safely set up the Trick Room, right? So this way the Cresselia doesn't get doubled up. And if they kill the Amoongus, then that's just a free switch into something like an Iron Hands or an Ursaluna, right? Second thing is there's 2 flying types, which is why, well, not really a flying type, but there's 1 flying type here in Dragonite. There's a Levitate Pokemon here, which means the Ursaluna likes to run Earthquake, and there is the Earthquake here, right? And you don't really want Rillaboom in that sense, right? Because the grassy terrain will just weaken Earthquake's damage, right? So in that sense, it doesn't really make too much sense to put the Rillaboom here. I understand that maybe you don't bring one over the other, but like I would imagine most games Ursaluna comes on a team like this, especially if it's centralized around Trick Room. So, you know, I understand maybe you don't bring both Rillaboom and Ursaluna, but at the same time, it's just a little bit better just to not have that kind of problem and just use the Amoongus in that sense, right? So, and then at the same time, you also have Rocky Helmet here. Again, this is a Rocky Helmet Amoongus. So, you know, Ursaluna doesn't want to have to deal with Urshifu Surging Strikes. At the same time, Ursaluna doesn't want to have to deal with Chien-Pao, you know, with the Ice Spinner shenanigans. You have the Terra Water Amoongus to help you against that. Same thing with like Dragonite stuff. Even Fluttermane, you know, you can always redirect attacks. So Amoongus is looking pretty good on a team like this. You know, just be able to be a threat within the Trick Room, you know, able to support the Cresselia, not interfere with the Ursaluna's Earthquake damage, you know, by throwing out grassy terrain in there. And then at the same time, you kind of need another support Pokemon on a team like this, because look at this. You have Dragonite as an offensive threat, Fluttermane, offensive, Ursaluna, offensive, Iron Hands, also relatively offensive. Cresselia is your only support Pokemon here. I think we need a little bit more here, and thankfully the Ursaluna and the Cresselia, they can give you that defensive backbone that a team needs, right? So it's like a 4+2 kind of rule, where like you have 4 potential sweepers and then 2, you know, defensive backbone Pokemon to be able to support those offensive threats, right? So in this case, yeah, I definitely like the Amoongus here. It makes a little bit more sense than the Rillaboom, because this is how they're choosing to play the Ursaluna, and there is you know, a Dragonite on this team. So it's a little bit better in terms of synergy to run the Earthquake as opposed to Headlong Rush. Can you replace the Dragonite with something like maybe a Heatran for in that sense? You could, right? And in that sense, you know, from there you can just run, you know, Headlong Rush, and then maybe you can even consider using the Rillaboom here, and then put something like Substitute on either the Heatran or the Fluttermane, and then that kind of changes the team a little bit, but you know, the essence is still there, right? So if you change the team, then one option will be better than the other, like I mentioned. But because the team is as constructed with these 5 as it is, Amoongus is in fact the better option on a team like this. So hopefully that makes sense. Let's take a look at a couple more squads. Okay, so this one is run by Alice and B and 5-0 record, very good score. This is one of the tri-attack tournaments. So basically, if you take a look at this team, it's almost like the opposite of the other team. It's a Tailwind team, Tornadus plus a lot of offensive threats, with Goldango, Urshifu, Rapid Strike, and Chi over here. And then here's a Rillaboom in the slot. And then here's a Farigiraf here. Okay, so is Rillaboom the better option over the Amoongus? Well, in my opinion, yes. And there's quite a few reasons actually, right? First of all, how many special attackers do we have on this team? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, right? And if you don't consider this slot, there's 4 special attackers and there's only 1 physical attacker. So we need another physical attacker on this team. We don't need a 5th special attacker, okay? If you want to have more balance on a squad, you almost want to try and even out your special and your physical attackers, at least at the start of your initial team building stages, right? So Rillaboom can definitely, give you that physical presence with the Urshifu, because now you also have Fake Out plus Surging Strikes as a tool that you can utilize, especially in a lead turn, right? And you also get Fake Out Pressure. You can set up your Tailwind. You can also potentially set up your Farigiraf's Trick Room here. Lots of different plays you can do with this Rillaboom. But all in all, definitely that's already one reason. The second reason is normally you would want an Amoongus on these Tailwind teams, just so that if there is a Trick Room team that you run into, you still have something to play against the Trick Room teams. Well, you don't really have to worry about that because you have a Farigiraf already, which already has Trick Room in prison. Okay, so I don't really need the Amoongus anymore. So now I might as well just go with a more offensive threat and throw in the Rillaboom. Okay, so now I have an aggressive grass type. And then at the same time, look at my Fire Water Grass core. I got Urshifu, I got Rillaboom, and Chi. So this is where, some of my damage is going to be coming from. In fact, a good majority of my damage is going to be coming from this Fire Water Grass core, especially at this Life Orb Chi, by the way, right? And then just considering like Tornadus doesn't really exert so much offensive pressure. I know it's got a base 125 attack stat, and I know this is focus stat, so it's probably just like max, but all in all, it doesn't really do as much damage. Now, maybe the Chi helps out with that a little bit because of Beads of Ruin, but Farigiraf also doesn't really do a whole lot of damage. So I've got like 2 relatively passive mons. If the Amoongus was here, that would have been 3 passive Pokemon. I don't want 3. I think 2 is the limit. So let's go a little bit more offensive here. Let's add an aggressive grass type rather than a supportive grass type. So this way my team is not so passive, right? Because I already have 2 of these mons, right? This thing just clicks Tailwind and probably dies the next turn. Right? Whereas the Farigiraf, yes, I understand it's bulky, it can stay on the field a little bit, but like it doesn't deal as much damage as one would like, right? It's more supportive, especially with this Rocky Helmet idea. So you have that sense, right? And then at the same time, what else do I need here? Yeah, that's pretty much it. I have my tool for Trick Room. Okay, I need another physical attacker. I don't need another support Pokemon. I have 2 already, and I just need something to give me a physical presence along with the Urshifu Rapid Strike, right? And the Rillaboom in this sense gives me that, okay? So hopefully this also makes sense in terms of our explanation. Let's look at one more team. Okay, this one is an 8-0 team. And okay, so right away I can see a lot of offensive threats. So look at that. We got Urshifu Rapid Strike, we got Chien-Pao, Rillaboom, and Dragonite. Okay, that's a very, very good standard core. You'll see this on a lot of starting teams that want to use Dragonite, Chien-Pao. They'll almost always have an Urshifu and a Rillaboom here. Then normally this would be a Fluttermane slot, but this is a Mimikyu instead. And now we have also a Heatran here with Substitute, right? So is Rillaboom the better option over something like Amoongus? And to me, yeah, I think so. Because again, do you have something, to be able to use within Trick Room? Yes, you do. You have a Mimikyu with Trick Room, okay? It also has Taunt, so you can deny another Trick Room user. And then at the same time, you also have a Heatran with Substitute. So you have 2 things that you can use within the Trick Room game. And then at the same time, you got 1, 2, 3 Pokemon with priority moves, okay? That you can just click and pretty much just disregard Trick Room, right? So not only do I have the tools against Trick Room, I can still play within it because I have a bunch of priority moves. Now that being said, there is the threat of Indeedee with Psychic Terrain to deny that. That is also why you have a Rillaboom, because now you can change that and flip those Psychic Terrains into now a Grassy Surge, a Grassy Terrain, and now you're free to click your priority moves again, okay? Now Farigiraf is another story, but you have plenty, for the Farigiraf on a team like this. right? So again, you know, I'm kind of pretty much asking you the same questions. Can you play within Trick Room? You know, do you have the tools, you know, that if not, maybe Amoongus might fit your team. Can you round out a Fire Water Grass court with Urshifu and Heatran here? Yes, you can. You have the Rillaboom here, okay? At the same time, you know, you have more of an offensive threat that maybe you just don't quite have in some of these other Pokemon. Like, for example, I do have Stomping Tantrum coverage, so ground coverage is pretty good here. I also have Earth Power and Stomping Tantrum coverage here, so maybe in this sense, probably Knockoff might be better, but, you know, it just doesn't hurt. And, you know, you did go 8-0 with it, so, you know, who am I to argue against it, right? But again, you can kind of see why a Rillaboom might be better, you know, as opposed to Amoongus, because, again, I just want to be more aggressive, okay? I already have my Trick Room outs, so let's just be more aggressive with the Rillaboom. Let's have Fake Out Surging Strikes. Let's, you know, give that Fire Water Grass core a nice, strong physical presence where now I can exert that on the opponent, especially in a best-of-3 format where maybe I just don't bring, you know, either Dragonite, Mimikyu, or Champ, or maybe just not all 3 of these Fire Water Grass core options, right? So yeah, but anyway, now you get a sense of like what we're trying to get at in terms of like having Rillaboom versus Amoongus. So, you know, do you want to run Trick Room, or do you need something against it? And at the same time, do you have too many special attackers? Do you need an extra physical attacker on your team? Do you need some pivot options, right? To go with your squad, or do you need like bulky redirection support? So this way you have, you know, setup Pokemon, right? Because a lot of these teams, you know, if you have a lot of setup, you know, for example, like Swords Dance and a Trick Room user, like the first thing that we showed, you need an Amoongus, right? You can't always rely on Fake Out. You can only click that once. Whereas Amoongus, you can click Rage Powder a bunch of times again and again until it dies and until you get the setup that you need, right? So I feel like setup heavy teams, they definitely want redirection support, right? Especially like those Indeedee Trick Room teams. You know, that's why Indeedee's there. It has Follow Me pressure. But anyway, I digress. So hopefully you got a little bit more of an understanding on when to use Amoongus and when to use Rillaboom. And if you got a squad of your own, and if you're not sure also if Rillaboom or Amoongus is the better choice, feel free to comment and feel free to ask. We'll help you out as best as we can here, because that is what we do on this channel. We like to help people out. We like to teach the game that is VGC. All right, so we'll be back with another video in the next one, guys. Peace out. Have a good one.